Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 of the Classical Era. And we're going to start this unit just the way we did the others by first defining what that word means, classical, and then talking about the general historical background of this period. And maybe we'll get into start to look at the characteristics of the music of this period in this lecture. We'll see how far we can get in about an hour or so. First, let's talk about the dates, 1750 to 1820. Remember, 1750 we used as the end of the Baroque era only because J.S. Bach died that year. That's really the only reason. Maybe that and the fact that it's exactly midway through the 18th century, the 1700s. But there isn't anything really particularly important about that year. And I think I also mentioned in a previous lecture talking about how, for example, J.S. Bach's style was beginning to be considered kind of old-fashioned in the last couple decades of his life. There's a gradual shift, a gradual transition from the style of the Baroque era in music to the classical era. But if we're going to have these classifications, we have to pick a year, and 1750 has traditionally been it. There's nothing, for example, equivalent to the invention of opera, which defined the beginning of the Baroque, at least in retrospect, right? So nothing particularly important about 1750 other than the fact that Bach died that year. And there's nothing particularly important about 1820 either. And in fact, some books will use 1825 instead, or maybe even 1830. Nothing in particular happened in any of those years to define the end of the classical era. There is a transition. Just as there is a gradual transition into this period, there's a gradual transition away from it as well. But we have to pick some years, so those are the ones we picked, at least that this textbook picked. And if you look at other textbooks, they will probably almost always have 1750, and they might have 1825, 1830, something like that. All right, so how about the word classical and maybe the word classic, obviously, which it is the root of the word classical. Well, unlike Baroque, this is a word that we use all the time. If we say that something is a classic, we are saying something good about it, right? Unlike, oddly enough, the word Baroque, which initially was meant as a criticism, as kind of a put-down. Something that is a classic is good. And what it generally tends to mean is it is something that is good because it has stood the test of time. And that's how we know that it's good. In other words, like fashions can come and go, but a classic stands the test of time, kind of stands above and outside of these changes in fashion, right? There are some other implications of that term, actually. And for example, if we are talking about the classical period in history, in general history, not in music history, but in general history, we are talking about the time of ancient Greece and Rome. That term, beginning around the 1600s, the term classic, which initially just implied of a higher class, right? Obviously, we have different classes of things. We have lower classes and higher classes. But if we said something was a classic, it implied that it was high class, right? And as we get into the Renaissance and people associate excellence with the ancient Greeks and Romans, then the word classical, it comes to be associated with those cultures because they are seen as superior, certainly superior to the European culture of the Middle Ages, at least from the perspective of a Renaissance person, right? That was the whole idea behind humanism, right? One of the ideas behind humanism, this reverence for all things Greek and Roman, and this view that the Middle Ages was a regrettable period of time, and if we could only get back to, if we could reach the heights of excellence that the Greeks and Romans achieved before everything went to hell and we had the Middle Ages, right? So to this day, if you go to a university and you study classics, you are studying Greek and Roman history, literature, languages, right? So there's that implication as well, and they're kind of tied together now in a way, because the aesthetic values, we might say, that we associate with things that are classical are very often, not always, but very often based on Greek and Roman models. So, for example, neoclassical architecture, such as you might find if you walk around the National Mall in Washington, D.C., right? Buildings that have an appearance sort of like an ancient Greek temple with columns and a pediment and this kind of thing. We refer to as neoclassical, neo meaning new, classical. So it's sort of a revived, a new version of classical architecture. Right? There are some other implications of this term which apply, again, not just to music, but to any of the arts or architecture or literature or anything. The classical approach is based on some assumptions. And one of those is that beauty, which is good, which is to be desired, right? And this is in the days before an artist would think of like deliberately creating something ugly. The arts kind of had to be beautiful. It was just understood. Nowadays, artists don't necessarily have that assumption that art had to be beautiful, but it was the case in earlier days. And what is beauty? Well, according to the classically minded person, beauty is not in the eye of the beholder, that cliche that we hear all the time. When we say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that implies subjectivity, that you and I could disagree on whether or not something is beautiful because it just comes down to individual subjective taste. And it's not something that could be like proven mathematically that this thing is beautiful, but that thing isn't. Well, a classically minded person would say, would take issue with that, would say, well, actually, there are certain principles, and it's not a purely subjective thing. I mean, maybe around the edges it is, but it's more objective. There are objective criteria which determine whether something is beautiful or not. And those criteria are things like balance, proportion, symmetry, right? A certain cleanness of style, not being overly decorated or overly embellished. In fact, this is one of the criticisms of the Baroque style. Remember, this term Baroque, we just got through the Baroque era. The term Baroque was only applied retroactively to the music of the Baroque era. People started calling that music Baroque during the classical era, right? Because they criticized it, saying it was too disproportionate, perhaps sort of overdone, misshapen, overly emotional, overly complex, according to their present value system in the arts, which was more classically minded, which had to do with balance, proportion, symmetry, emotional restraint. So that's what the classically minded person would say. There are certain objective criteria to beauty. So, for example, symmetry and proportion. So, we might disagree about whether a certain person's face is beautiful or not. But if they have a giant nose that is disproportionate to the rest of their face, it's unlikely that we're going to say that person looks beautiful. We might not be rude and tell them that. But they might be aware that they have a giant disproportionate nose, but you get my idea. Nobody is really thinking, wow, that person is beautiful. I love that giant disproportionate nose, right? Same thing with symmetry. If I had like one ear that was much larger than the other, one eye that was much bigger than the other, if my face were somehow asymmetrical, right? People would look at me strange and like, wow, that, too bad about that guy, So we value these things, and you can deny it all you want, the classically minded person would say. I'm just presenting their argument, right? You can deny it all you want, but this is how we arrive at a definition of beauty. It is based on things like proportionality, balance, symmetry, right? And so that's sort of the paradigm, I guess you could say, that the classically minded person kind of assumes and applies. All right, so I've talked about as much as I want to about that word, except I guess to note once again, as I did at the very beginning of this course, there's a problem with the word classical as applied to music, because when you talk about classical music, you could be talking about anything from Gregorian chant up to a John Williams film score that was just composed very recently, right? If you were to search in the classical bin at a record store on iTunes or whatever, you would get that huge variety of music that we call classical. But we have this distinct period within quote unquote classical music called the classical era, and it's only about 70 years long, from 1750 to 1820. And so that's why, for example, the beginning of this course, I used the word Western art music, but it's just kind of cumbersome to say Western art music, and instead we tend to say classical music. But just keep in mind that has two meanings. Usually if we're talking about music of this era, we would say music of the classical period or music of the classical era, as distinct from classical music. Okay, now about the general historical era that is going on in the background. We do not call it the classical period in history. That's the term we use, again, for the ancient Greeks and Romans, right? Let's say from about maybe the 8th century BC up to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. The period of time that is simultaneous with the classical era in music, we would refer to as the Enlightenment, or maybe towards the latter part of the Enlightenment. Sometimes the Enlightenment is referred to as the 18th century Enlightenment, so the 1700s. So that's the term we would give for the general historical period. And what does that mean? Obviously, it has something to do with becoming enlightened, like we were in the dark before and now we are enlightened. Well, that's the way some of the leading thinkers, like French philosophers who came up with this term, they mention a couple of them here. Voltaire, who is usually like the first person maybe mentioned whenever we think of the Enlightenment, is Voltaire. Although I should also mention here that there's really more than just one Enlightenment going on. There's a French Enlightenment, and there's more of an English and Scottish Enlightenment, and they have different aspects. The Enlightenment is such a vast and complex phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, and a fascinating period in human history. You could literally spend the rest of your life doing nothing but studying the Enlightenment. People have done that, right? It's huge. It's a big deal. And in fact, I think a lot of the assumptions that we have, the way that we think, you and I, if you hear the sound of my voice, it's very likely that you are walking around with all kinds of assumptions in your head about things that are born of Enlightenment thinking. The country we live in, the United States of America, is a product of the Enlightenment. Something like the U.S. Constitution, definitely a product of the Enlightenment. The idea that all men are created equal. It really should be all people, but they use the word men, and of course they didn't really apply it, right? Back when those words were written, right? We still had slavery. We had definite inequality among the sexes, but that was the ideal, right? That just that idea, no matter how well it was lived up to, however well it was, whether it was a false promise at the time or whatever. Just the idea itself is definitely an Enlightenment idea. The idea that you should have free speech, definitely an Enlightenment idea. The idea of separation of church and state, right? These are ideas that would seem very strange and radical and bizarre in an earlier time, right? But this period, the Enlightenment, is when these ideas are sort of beginning to percolate up from philosophers and leading thinkers and radicals and becoming more widely accepted among what we might call ordinary people for various reasons that we will get into. All right, let's sort of just touch on some of the things that the book mentions. And they start off, I think, although it's with so many of these historical phenomena, it's hard to point to one thing as what started it. That's not how things work. There are many different, facets to this thing that we are looking at. But they start with the scientific revolution. So we have a scientific revolution going on in the 17th century. They mention specifically Galileo and Newton, but there are many, many others. Those are maybe just the most significant, or a couple of the most significant. So we have a scientific revolution that's been going on in the 1600s, and we could even say going on before that. We could trace really a lot of what goes on with the Enlightenment. We can trace it back to the Renaissance, right? This rediscovery and reappreciation for all things Greek and Roman, the accomplishments, etc. And one of those things was scientific inquiry. And this is, again, part of this spirit of humanism, right? Well, once we embarked on that sort of voyage of discovery, of scientific discovery, and once there came to be something that we now call the scientific method, although again, that's a little misleading. There wasn't any one scientific method. There are different methods that scientists use. Some of them are maybe involve more math than others, and others maybe involve more direct observation or thought experiments or whatever. But the idea of applying a method rigorously to something, of experimentation, of close observation, of making precise measurements, taking notes, running experiments, trying to duplicate those experiments, and coming up with a result that might not be the result you expected, right? And that might overturn what people had thought for thousands of years before, right? Starting off skeptical, right? The idea of like, well, I'm not going to take anything for granted. I'm going to experiment and measure and examine for myself. I don't care what Aristotle said about this or that, or what Plato said, or what was taught, even though they're Greeks and we respect them and all of that, and they're wonderful. I'm not even going to take them for granted. If I'm a scientist, I'm going to examine on my own. And again, I might have a hypothesis, I might have an idea, but I'm going to reserve judgment on whether that hypothesis is correct until I have done experimentation, measurement, whatever. And then I will have a theory. And even that theory is conditional. I'm going to settle on that theory if it seems to explain the phenomenon that I have been observing as a scientist. But that theory could be overturned if someone does different experiments and comes up with a better explanation, a better theory, right? And once this sort of scientific community, and right there, the idea of a scientific community, one of the features of the scientific revolution, again, made possible by the printing press, by greater literacy, is that scientists were communicating with each other. They had journals, they had societies where they would publish articles in these journals, and then other scientists would go and test, try and duplicate the experiment that some scientists had done. And so all of this process in the sciences tends to give people the idea, like other people who are maybe not even scientists, maybe people who are more like philosophers, although philosophers and scientists, in those days, there was not as sharp a distinction. But it leads people to think, well, if we can get these tremendous results, if we can learn so much about nature in ways that improve people's lives, which is certainly happening by this time, right? In so many ways. I mean, it doesn't apply so much to medicine until a little bit later. The doctors still kind of don't know what they're doing during this period, but things like improved crop yields, developing machinery that is labor saving, for example, and just the sheer increase in knowledge about things during the scientific revolution, things that might not have an application until later on, but nonetheless, the knowledge is valuable in its own right. It leads people to think, what if we applied the same kinds of rigorous, objective, scientific methods, not just to the study of nature, but to everything, to all aspects of human life? What if we just simply became much more rational and logical? That's what the Enlightenment is all about. It's sort of like using the head, right? It's a very head-based approach to things. And we will see later on there's a reaction to this as we get into our next era, the Romantic era, which is more kind of heart-based, although romantic doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. We'll get to that when we get to our next unit. But that is what is meant by the Enlightenment. The idea of examining, scrutinizing things, and throwing away that which is illogical, which doesn't make sense, right? And one of the things that the most, let's say, the leading edge Enlightenment thinkers, one of the things that they began to feel did not make sense was religion. Now, certainly not all Enlightenment thinkers were atheists. Some of them were deists. They believed in sort of like a watchmaker god, sort of like, I mean, they mention Newton here. Newton, people credited Newton with sort of like taking the back off of the clock that is the universe and figuring out how all the gears worked. They had this idea of sort of like a deterministic clockwork universe once we figure out the laws of motion and all of that. Newton himself actually was a very religious man, but nonetheless, as we move into the 18th century, there comes to be a reaction against the church and against religiosity generally. It's seen as, by, again, the leading current edge, like the avant-garde intellectuals, as being backward and superstitious and irrational, and also of keeping people kind of in an oppressed state. This is another aspect of the Enlightenment. The idea that, I mentioned before, the idea that people should be equal, that maybe this idea of these different classes of people, what's that all about? Like you are a member of the aristocracy, you have a noble title, you're a duke or an earl or a king. Why? Just because your father was a duke or an earl or a king? Again, we find this whole, in this country, in America, which deliberately rejected that kind of system. We don't have titles of nobility. We don't have anything like that here. We rejected it because we are a product, our country, our Constitution is a product of the Enlightenment, and we saw that as irrational and also sort of detrimental to humanity. Why should a very small class of people have such power, have such privileges? We could also say the same of the clergy, right? So this is another thing that's going on in the background here. think back over our different eras that we've talked about, right? So starting with the Middle Ages, this is the time when the church, the Catholic Church, is at the peak of its power, right? But as we get to the latter part of the Middle Ages, the church starts declining in power, partly due to its own corruption or whatever. And as we move into the Renaissance, the nobility, which had been sort of like, the second class, that the clergy were the most powerful class overall, really. And there were clashes, of course, all through the Middle Ages between these two classes, one trying to get the upper hand over the other. But ultimately, in a society that believes very literally in heaven and hell, and believes that the clergy, that you got to do right by the clergy, can't annoy the Pope if you want to get into heaven, if people really believe that, then the clergy is going to have tremendous power. But as people become, let's say, more enlightened, or as let's say we move into a Renaissance, when people are looking back to a time before the rise in power of the Catholic Church, are looking back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that's what they value, and they might still believe in God and all that, but they don't necessarily, have such high regard for the church, or think that the church has, or that the clergy has the final word on whether you're getting into heaven or hell, right? And then we have the Reformation, of course, and Martin Luther rejects the idea altogether that the clergy, that a priest can decide you're going to hell on behalf of God, And Calvin, the same thing. Of course, Calvin believed that it was determined from the beginning of time who was going to heaven or hell, and there's not really much you could do about it one way or another, that God had already decided, right? So, in any case, the church begins this long, slow decline in power, and in the Renaissance we begin to see the ascent of the nobility. And this reaches its peak during the era we just studied, what we call the Baroque era music, which coincides with the age of absolutism, when absolute rulers, like, they use the example of Louis XIV, but there are lots of other monarchs in Europe we could point to. This is when they are at the peak of their power. They have absolute power very often in their respective countries. Well, now that we're moving into the 18th century, and certainly as we move into the 19th century, the nobility are beginning to descend in power gradually, sometimes more gradually in some places and less gradually in others, right? We have a revolution in France. But now, definitely, the aristocracy is declining in power. And who is taking its place? Well, we might say the middle class, although that term is, again, kind of doesn't mean the same thing today as it meant back then. But nonetheless, it's still a useful term. So the middle class is growing in size. Now remember, I said, like, back in the Middle Ages, there wasn't even really such thing as a middle class. There were some, let's say, skilled tradesmen and merchants and bureaucrat type people, lawyers, doctors, whatever, living in the cities, but they're a very, very thin sliver of society, right? The vast majority of non-nobles or non-clergy were peasants working the fields. And that's the way it was for a very, very long time. Still in the 18th century, the vast majority of people are peasants working in the fields. It's still an agrarian. We haven't quite reached the Industrial Revolution yet. We will toward the end of this period. But until we reach that Industrial Revolution, we still need the majority of people to work the land. It's very labor intensive, and but as we move through the Renaissance into the age of absolutism, this middle class, what I'm going to call the middle class, or the class of educated, usually city dwellers who maybe don't necessarily work with their hands. I mean, they might be skilled craftsmen, but they might have sort of more what you call a white collar job of some kind. They might be some kind of a merchant or a banker, a lawyer, a bureaucrat, something like that. Um, these people are getting better and better educated. Remember, education was a big part of this. The ability for a certain class of people to be in a position of power. Not during the entire Middle Ages, the only educated people were the clergy, and then towards the end of the Middle Ages, the nobility take an interest in education. Well, now we've had a middle class, a prosperous, cultured, usually urban middle class for long enough that these people are now educated, right? Some of them are quite wealthy, actually. Now, they're not wealthy because necessarily they inherited a ton of money. It's because they earned it, right? But these people still don't have really any political rights. They can't vote. Nobody's voting for the king or whatever. They have very little, they have really no political power, and they're starting to resent it. And they have ideas about equality. Like, why, again, what makes this nobleman any better than me? Especially since, he probably inherited all his wealth, and I had to earn mine. I have to work for a living. So, this middle class now, over the course of the next decades, is rising in power and influence and demanding its rights, right? Asserting its rights, right? And that's kind of where we get this idea that all men are created equal, whatever. Again, however well it is put into practice, just the fact that the idea is out there, even if we aren't quite living up to it yet, the fact that the idea is out there is important. Okay. Again, touching back on the book. So it says here, by the middle of the 18th century, faith in the power of reason was so great that it began to undermine the authority of the social and religious establishment. That's kind of an interesting contradiction there. Faith in the power of reason, right? Faith and reason are kind of like the opposite from each other. If we take something on faith, even if it seems unreasonable, then we believe it because we have faith in it. Reason is like the scientific method, for example, right? It's using logic, observing things, taking measurements, whatever, looking at causes and effects, and not taking anything on faith. Science begins with skepticism, the opposite of faith. Nonetheless, this is true. People begin to have faith in the power of reason. Why? Because it's making their lives better. All of these discoveries, once they kind of trickle down, they can be applied to people's lives, and people are unquestionably starting to live more prosperous. Maybe not, looking back by our standards, a lot of people still are pretty hard up, but it's not just that science figures out, wow, that's amazing, I never knew that before, but that it has a positive impact on people's lives. So that's why the model of sort of the application of reason, the scientific method, etc. But it also undermines the authority of the social and religious establishment. That is, the class system, the power of the church, which is still fairly powerful at this time. Philosophers and writers, especially Voltaire and Diderot, saw their time as a turning point in history and referred to it as the Age of Enlightenment. So these people are consciously, sort of like the people in the Renaissance, who were consciously referring to their own time as a Renaissance, as a rebirth of the values or the quest for excellence or whatever of the greatness and glory of Greece and Rome. These people consciously see this as a project, the Enlightenment as a project. They believed in progress, holding that reason, not custom or tradition, was the best guide for human conduct. Right? So they believed in progress. This is an Enlightenment idea I think that we all have in our heads. Now, maybe the last decade or so, our faith in progress, that an inevitable progress, that things are always going to get better, that our faith in that idea might have been shaken. But I think it is true that we generally have an idea that things are getting better. We are used to. I mean, this is kind of a trivial example, but our products becoming more and more capable. Especially if you've lived during the age of the cell phone. I'm old enough to remember that when I first saw a cell phone, it was like the size of a World War II walkie-talkie. It was like a giant brick. And then they got smaller and smaller, and then they had touch screens on them, and now you have this handheld computer that can do anything. I mean, if that's not evidence of progress, then what is? Well, this is a time of tremendous progress that is in all areas of life. I would say this period of time saw more rapid progress within a person's lifetime than any period prior to this. In other words, if you're growing up in the Middle Ages or even in the Renaissance, the idea of progress, you just didn't see it. Over the course of your lifetime, your life was probably going to be very much like your father and his father before him, depending on which class of society you were in. You didn't see things change. You didn't say, wow, there's a new thing. Things in the experience, the lived experience of most people, they did not see much in the way of change, certainly not to the extent that we see in the 18th century, right? Again, as much of it as a result of the previous, this explosion in scientific inquiry and the results that it generated. So, for example, is one of my pet peeves whenever someone says, oh, they're talking about, let's say, the Constitution, and they say, well, the founding fathers, they lived back in the 1700s. They could never have imagined X, Y, and Z, something like, airplanes or machine guns or something like this. Actually, they could and did, right? Because they lived during a time of unbelievable progress. I think they could imagine a whole lot of things that we just assume that because they lived 200 years ago, they couldn't possibly imagine. Well, I think they could imagine. Because they had seen so much progress. And like, for example, I think if you were to ask Thomas Jefferson, do you think that man will ever fly to the moon and land on the moon? Now, I don't know this for a fact. Or do you think there will ever be powered airplanes, let's say by the year 2000? I think he would say, well, I would hope so. I would expect so. Given the progress that we've seen just in the last, 50 years, I would expect it, even sooner than that, right? So, this is an age of where progress is manifest. It is right before people's eyes. So people believe in progress. They think it's going to go on like this forever. And I think we still have, this is one of these ideas that we kind of have built in. We kind of expect it. We expect things to progress, things to get better. Our devices, for example, and that's maybe, again, a trivial example, but I think you get my point that they believed in progress, holding that reason, not custom or tradition, was the best guide for human conduct. And obviously, like the class system, based totally on custom and tradition. All these kind of... Now, there were some people who said, well, maybe not every custom and tradition should be thrown out. Maybe there's a reason for them. So there are different strands of enlightenment. That might be more like the English strand of enlightenment, whereas the French might be more radical. And this is a lot of what we saw in the French Revolution. If you studied the French Revolution at all, it's kind of like throwing out all tradition, maybe sort of a more radical approach. But nonetheless, there is a great skepticism about customs and traditions. Why do we do the things we do? Is it just because that's the way they've always been done? Doesn't seem very rational, right, to an enlightened person, quote unquote. Now, it says here, the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers were implemented by several rulers during the 18th century. In other words, we do have some, it's not the case that all of these absolute rulers, like from the age of absolutism, necessarily resisted this trend. Some of them embraced it and saw that it would make the lives of their subjects, maybe make their nation more powerful, first of all, make their people happier and healthier, and well, why not implement them? So they mention some of these what are called enlightened despots or enlightened monarchs, like Emperor Joseph II of Austria. If you've ever seen the movie Amadeus about Mozart, that's the emperor in that movie is Emperor Joseph II. They mention him specifically. There are a couple of others, like Catherine the Great of Russia. Frederick the Great of Prussia, I would say as well. But they mention Emperor Joseph II of Austria, who abolished serfdom. Well, that's a pretty big deal, right? No more serfs, no more people who are kind of like owned by the nobleman who owns the land, right? So abolished serfdom, closed monasteries and convents, and eliminated the nobility's special status in criminal law. This is something that you might not have been aware about, but if you're of the nobility in these days, not only do you have, you have a title and everyone has to defer to you if they're, a commoner of lower class, and you have this inherited land, inherited wealth, whatever. There was an entirely separate legal system for these people. So, for example, if somehow you wronged a commoner in whatever way, you injured him, that commoner couldn't really sue you or take you to court or whatever, because there was a completely different court system, right? There was one for the nobility and one for everybody else. And just to give an example of how this kind of thing could play out, Beethoven, Ludwig van Beethoven, underwent a nasty custody battle over custody of his nephew, who he was trying to get custody of his nephew, the son of his brother, after his brother died. Beethoven didn't like his sister-in-law, the mother of this boy, and so he fought this lengthy court battle, ultimately won. So they had to go to court, and there was a misunderstanding in Germany, because normally in Germany, if you have a von in front of your name, V-O-N, like Otto von Bismarck, it signals that you are of the nobility. Anyone who has a von in their name. In Germany, it's that's how you know they're of the nobility. It means like of, right? And it means that you are a landowner, which means you're of the noble class. But it doesn't mean the same thing in Dutch, and Beethoven's ancestry was actually Dutch. He was a van, and van in Dutch doesn't mean that you are of the nobility. But of course, spelling was kind of casual back then, and these people didn't necessarily know that Beethoven was of German origin, of Dutch origin, and that he spelled his name with an A instead of an O. And there was actually a kind of an embarrassing moment for him in court when it was revealed that he was not actually of the nobility, and that he didn't have this special status that you would have had if you were of the nobility, etc. Anyway, that's just kind of an anecdote but it was the case that there was a two-tiered system of justice, we might say. One for the nobility, one for the commoners. If you were a commoner, you could not even enter into a court of the nobility to testify or to press a suit against a nobleman. So this is one of the things that is resented by this growing middle class that is asserting itself and asserting its rights. Violent political and social upheaval marked the 70-year period from 1750 to 1820. Oh, you better believe it. This was another way to think of this time. When you think of, let's say, the 1960s in the United States, what do you think of? Oh, it was a turbulent time. You've got the civil rights movement. You've got the Vietnam War and all the protests against that. There's sort of the beginning of the women's rights movement. You have these assassinations of prominent figures like JFK and RFK and Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. So people think of it as a time of like upheaval and of generational conflict, let's say, between the older generation that had grown up during the Depression and had fought in World War II, what we today call like the greatest generation, who are pretty much died out by now, and their children, who were wearing their hair long and taking drugs and going to Woodstock and rolling around in the mud and whatever, and this sort of the father with the crew cut and the horn-rimmed glasses who had fought in World War II is like looking at these people like, what? This generation has lost its mind. They have no respect for the customs and traditions and right. Something similar is going on in the 18th century, or let's say, for our purposes, during this period of music, 1750 to 1820. The historical periods don't always line up exactly with the musical periods, but nonetheless, certainly from 1750 to 1820, this is a time of, it's like the 1960s, but for 70 years instead of just a decade, right? This is when we have the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And we have all kinds of things going on that, the French Revolution in particular, this overthrowing of this ancient regime in France that goes back 1,000 years, the nobility, the French nobility. So it is a revolutionary, convulsive kind of time. Of course, that's also the period of the American Revolution, but the American Revolution, although certainly inspired by some of these same ideas, right? That we're rebelling against the king because we feel we have certain rights or privileges. Actually, the colonists were kind of asserting their rights, their traditional rights as Englishmen, right? That, for example, no taxation without representation, all that kind of thing. They were kind of asserting their traditional rights as Englishmen. Whereas in France, and of course the American, we're just trying to break away from the mother country. We weren't trying to, kick King George III off the throne. But that's what the French Revolution was about, right? And they did not only kick Louis XVI off the throne, they beheaded him and his family. All right, a violent overthrow of this old order in fact, the entire French nobility was really was in a lot of danger during this time. Many of them fled to England. Many of them renounced their nobility. They said, "Okay, I'm giving up my royal titles. I'm giving up my lands. Please just don't kill me." So these years were convulsed by the 7 Years' War, the American and French Revolutions, and the Napoleonic Wars. Political and economic power shifted from the aristocracy and the church to the middle class. Social mobility increased to a point that Napoleon could become emperor of France by his own genius rather than as a birthright. So, this, the example of Napoleon was, of course, before he kind of destroyed Europe by a series of wars. But before that, his rise to become emperor of France. I mean, Napoleon was not of the nobility, and he wasn't even French, and yet he became emperor of France. Napoleon was really more Italian than French. He was from Corsica. He was Corsican. And I think he might have been of a very minor, very low-ranked, impoverished nobility. I don't recall. Technically, he might not have been a commoner, but he certainly was not French royalty. That's not how he became emperor. He became emperor because he joined the military, as becoming a very, very junior officer, and he was brilliant, especially at artillery, right? And he was hardworking, and he rose through the ranks of the military by his brilliance, by his intelligence, by his ability. Not, as was very often the case in the military back in those days, it was, are you a gentleman? What class are you from? Are you of the nobility? People became commanders, became officers, not necessarily based on any ability, but because of who their father was, So Napoleon not only, rose very rapidly. I think he became a general by the time he was 25 years old, rose very rapidly through the ranks based on his ability and his genius, but then eventually became emperor. He's like the ultimate self-made man, and the sort of the ultimate figure against this old, hidebound tradition of who gets to be a ruler and who gets to be even an officer in the army. Subversive new slogans like Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which is the slogan of the French Revolution. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood is what they mean by fraternity. sprang from the people's lips. All established ideas were being re-examined, including the existence of God. So skepticism about everything, especially things that seem irrational, where there's no basis there's nothing you can prove. Okay, now having talked about all of that stuff, they start to sort of zero in on the arts. And we do see some parallels and developments in the visual arts, let's say in literature and in music. And they talk about these sort of like sub eras or sub periods, sub styles within this time. It says, during the early 18th century, the heavy, monumental Baroque style gave way to the more intimate Rococo style, with its light colors, curved lines, and graceful ornaments. And then there's another change in taste by the later 18th century. The Rococo art became seen as frivolous, excessively ornamented, lacking in ethical content, and it was superseded by the neoclassical style, again, new classical, which attempted to recapture the noble simplicity and calm grandeur of ancient Greek and Roman art. So, for example, a great example of this, there's two pictures in your book. I mean, I'm just going to hold them up briefly to the screen. So here's an example of a Rococo painting, and it's just very pleasant. It's just, people outdoors, and there's nothing particularly important going on here, right? It's just a pleasant afternoon outside. The music concert. So some people playing music outside, and it's pleasant, it's light, it's not overly serious, there's no big message, right? There's, it's just meant to be entertaining, pleasing, right? And light. Here is an example of a neoclassical. This is the very famous Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David. Jacques-Louis David, by the way, the most important French artist of this time, sort of, kind of like a chronicler of this period in art, of this like revolutionary period. And this painting, there is some definite, first of all, notice the structure of it, right? The background is, of course, Socrates is about to drink the hemlock. He's in a prison cell, but notice the background is very plain. And the figures, notice, first of all, what's the subject matter? It has to do with classical antiquity, right? Notice that the figures look like, Greek statues almost. And you can see right in the exact middle, the structure of this painting, if you look in the exact middle, there is the cup, the chalice full of hemlock that Socrates is about to drink. Now, think back, if you recall, why did Socrates drink hemlock? Why was he forced to do this? Well, he was accused by the Athenian democracy really put Socrates to death. Unfortunately, he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens because Socrates was kind of like a teacher, or he was sort of like he wasn't a teacher in the sense that I'm a teacher, like a professional, like he made money off of it. He was sort of more like a teacher, kind of like Jesus was a teacher. He had a group of disciples, of young men who followed him around, hoping to learn from him, and they would go and sit in a public place somewhere, and they would discuss whatever they felt like discussing. And Socrates would apply the Socratic method, right? He would ask questions. He would kind of like probe you and say, well, you're assuming this. Couldn't we make the case X, Y, and Z, right? And by probing, by accepting nothing as taking nothing for granted, by being skeptical, right? Maybe we can eventually arrive at knowledge, at wisdom, right? And this was seen as a threat to many of the people of Athens, the people who had, let's say, privileged positions. They thought that Socrates was corrupting the youth of Athens, giving them, filling their heads with funny ideas that might cause them to be disobedient or rebellious or whatever. And also, to question, causing them to question their belief in the gods, the Greek gods. And so Socrates was put on trial. And Socrates didn't seek to defend himself. He didn't really care. He cared less about his own life than the principle that, look, I should be able to discuss whatever I want to. This is where we get this famous utterance, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? Which Socrates supposedly said. And so therefore, if I'm not allowed to just sit with my friends and discuss whatever we feel like discussing, if I don't have freedom of speech, freedom of thought, to examine life, then yeah, I'll take the hemlock. I would rather die than live an unexamined life, right? So Socrates is seen as a hero by Jacques-Louis David and others of a similar Enlightenment mindset. He is seen, in fact, exactly, it's sort of like Socrates died just the way Jesus died, as a martyr, except whereas Jesus died for our sins to keep us from going into hell, I guess, Socrates died for our minds, for our freedom of, to think and say whatever we want. And so he's portrayed, there's a deliberate attempt here, I think. If you look at the figure of Socrates, he is continuing to teach. He has one, he's making some kind of a point, about something important. He's continuing to teach to his students even as he takes the cup. And notice he doesn't even look at the cup. He doesn't even regard the cup. He's more focused on his teaching, right? What he has to say. But yeah, he has to drink the hemlock, so he's reaching over for the cup. But with his arms in this position, outstretched, what does it remind you of? It's deliberately meant to remind you of Jesus on the cross, the sort of iconography of it. So someone like Socrates is sort of like again, a martyr figure for someone who identifies as enlightened. This, Socrates is kind of like their Jesus, right? In a sense, if you can kind of follow that. And this painting is definitely in this neoclassical style. Okay, I've already gone on for quite a while here, and 57 minutes. So I'm going to hold off on talking about characteristics of the classical style in music until the next lecture. But I just, in the remaining few minutes here, don't worry too much about these, what are the dates of the Rococo period versus the dates of the neoclassical period. Just be aware there are some shifts in both music and the visual arts, right? So these different styles or these different movements often run in parallel between, let's say, literature and the visual arts and music. So we definitely have music that is, we have Rococo music as well as Rococo painting and Rococo architecture, right? And we have neoclassical music as well as neoclassical painting and neoclassical architecture. One thing, though, that is different, I'll say, about music as opposed to the other arts. In the other arts, people who idolize the Greeks and Romans, right? Let's say if you're an architect or if you're a writer or if you're a painter, you have models on which to base your ideas or your art even, right? If you want to create a building that imitates the style of a Greek temple, there are still ruins of Greek temples or Roman temples or whatever that you could actually go and see. Right? You have examples to draw from. If you are a writer and you admire the literary works of the Greeks and Romans, there are still existing. You can read Livy or whatever, but that's not true of music. There are no models, right? Remember, only a tiny handful of written down music has been preserved from before the Middle Ages, and these people would, people in this time hadn't even really discovered it yet or deciphered it, right? Still to this day, we have very, very few examples. So it's not like a classical or a classically minded whatever musician can say, well, I'm going to write music sort of like what the Romans and Greeks had. We have no idea what it sounded like. Now, one exception, I guess, to this, there was the attempt of opera. Remember, when opera was invented at the beginning of the Baroque, the idea was to try and recreate Greek drama. Now, these Greek dramas, the tragedies of, Aeschylus or Sophocles or Euripides or whatever, they still existed. Some of them, unfortunately, many of them have been lost. But you can read them, but you don't know what. And there was definitely music involved in them, but we don't know what the music sounded like. So that the inventors of opera had to sort of half guess on how it might have been done, how this written text might have actually been performed, and they had the idea that it was sung rather than merely spoken, and so they came up with this recitative, So with that one exception, which again is, they really didn't know what Greek music really sounded like, or Roman music even less. There are no surviving examples of Roman music, which is kind of interesting considering how long the Roman Empire was around. So that's one important difference in, let's say, literature, the visual arts, architecture. They could actually directly imitate surviving examples of Greek or Roman art. The same doesn't apply to music. So instead, we have these principles, right? The principles of balance, proportion, symmetry, a certain amount of emotional restraint, not going overboard on the emotions, being sort of more cool and objective rather than subjective, right? There is also, and I'm going to close on this point, there's a preoccupation with form, with structure, that it is structure that generates beauty, right? So we're going to learn a lot about forms, the forms, the structures that composers used in this era, along with a bunch of other things. But there's going to be a heavy emphasis on structure or form. We're going to learn a lot of different forms and a lot of characteristics of this classical style, beginning with our next lecture. So we'll see you then.